My life was a grid, a carefully curated collection of straight lines and right angles. As a graphic designer, I found comfort in alignment, in the predictable harmony of negative space and balanced composition. My apartment was an extension of this philosophy. Books arranged by color and height, coffee mugs hung with their handles all facing east, a routine so ingrained it felt less like a choice and more like a law of physics. I built these walls of order not just to keep the world out, but to keep myself in, contained within a space where I understood all the rules. Then Liam moved in. He was chaos in human form, a glorious 6'3" disruption to my meticulously ordered universe. He was my best friend from college, and when his lease fell through, offering him my spare room felt like the only decent thing to do. I just hadn't anticipated the way his presence would fundamentally alter the geometry of my life. He was a carpenter, and he carried the scent of sawdust and cedar with him like a second skin, a warm, earthy cologne that clung to the upholstery and settled in the air, a constant, pleasant reminder of his existence. He was everything I was not. Where I was quiet and contained, Liam was expansive. His laugh was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. His shoulders were broad, filling doorways, and his hands, calloused and capable, could fix a leaky faucet or assemble a flat-pack bookcase with an ease that felt like a kind of magic. He moved with a steady, unhurried confidence that I could only ever admire from a distance, like a piece of classical sculpture in a museum. Perfect, solid, and separated from me by a velvet rope of my own making. That rope was woven from 1,000 threads of impossibility. The most prominent thread, thick and unyielding, was the fact that I was in love with him. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a slow, creeping dawn that had broken over the years of our friendship. It was in the way my breath would catch when he'd emerge from his room in the morning, hair sleep mussed, and a lazy smile on his face. It was in the ache in my chest when he'd talk about a date with some girl, his descriptions always clinical and detached, yet a reminder of the chasm between us. He was, as far as I had ever known, completely and unshakably straight. And he was my best friend. So I became a curator of secrets, a silent archivist of unrequited affection. My life with him became a gallery of small, precious moments that I would catalog and revisit in the quiet of my own mind. The way he'd absent-mindedly run a hand through his thick, dark hair when he was concentrating on a sketch for a new project. The sound of his steady breathing from his bedroom across the hall, a comforting rhythm in the dead of night. The accidental brush of his arm against mine as we passed in the narrow hallway, a jolt of warmth that would linger for hours. I lived in the margins of his life, a footnote to his main story. I convinced myself that this was enough. The quiet hum of his presence in my home, the easy camaraderie of our friendship. It was a pale imitation of what I truly wanted, but it was safe. It was ordered. To risk that for a confession that would only lead to rejection and awkwardness was to invite a wrecking ball into my carefully constructed life. I couldn't bear the thought of the silence that would replace his laughter, the empty space where his warm, chaotic energy used to be. So I kept my feelings locked away, another perfectly aligned object in my sterile world. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, announcing itself with a low, guttural growl that vibrated in my chest. It was the kind of storm that felt biblical, an atmospheric tantrum that shook the old apartment building to its foundations. Rain didn't just fall. It came in horizontal sheets, lashing against the windows with a furious, relentless rhythm. The lights flickered once, twice, and then surrendered, plunging us into a sudden, profound darkness broken only by the strobing flashes of lightning. Well, Liam's voice rumbled from the living room, calm and steady as always. Guess that's it for the Wi-Fi. I was in the kitchen, fumbling for the emergency candles I kept in the junk drawer, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I hated storms. I hated the loss of control, the raw, untamed power of it all. Liam, of course, was unfazed. I heard him moving, his familiar, heavy footfalls a comforting counterpoint to the chaos outside. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, a silhouette against the flickering lightning, the flashlight on his phone casting a cone of pale light that made his features seem carved from stone. "You okay, Ethan?" he asked, his voice soft. I managed a nod, my hands finally closing around the waxy cylinder of a candle. Fine. Just loud. He gave a small, understanding smile. Yeah, it's a big one. He lit a few candles with a lighter he produced from his pocket, and the kitchen was filled with a warm, dancing glow. The shadows it cast were deep and unfamiliar, transforming our mundane space into something intimate and strange. We spent the next hour sitting at the kitchen table, talking in low voices, the storm a constant, roaring presence outside our little bubble of light. It was sometime after midnight when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic drip. Drip, drip, drip. I froze, straining to hear over the din of the rain. Liam noticed the shift in my posture. What is it? Do you hear that? I whispered. We both fell silent, listening. There it was again, a persistent, watery metronome. We followed the sound to my bedroom. Liam shone his phone's light toward the ceiling. In the center, a dark, ominous stain was spreading across the plaster. And from the middle of it, a steady stream of water was plopping onto the very center of my duvet. My perfectly made bed, the epicenter of my ordered sanctuary, was under assault. A sense of helpless panic seized me. My space, my control, was literally being dissolved by the storm. My bed was soaked. The floor was starting to puddle. The room was cold and smelled of damp plaster and rain. Damn, Liam breathed, his voice a low curse. He was already in problem-solving mode, grabbing my desk trash can to put under the leak. Old buildings. Guess the roof finally gave up. I just stood there, staring at the spreading puddle on my hardwood floor, the entire structure of my evening, my night, my carefully planned week, collapsing around me. I had nowhere to sleep. The couch was old and lumpy, an instrument of torture more than a piece of furniture. Liam seemed to read my mind. He turned from the pathetic sight of the dripping ceiling and looked at me, his expression backlit by the phone's glow. Hey, he said, his voice gentle. It's fine. You can take my bed. I blinked. And you'll sleep where? On that couch. He shrugged, a simple, broad movement of his shoulders. I can handle it. No, I said, the word coming out faster than I intended. The thought of him, my 6'3" friend, contorted on that tiny, ancient sofa while I slept comfortably was absurd. No, I can't do that. A silence stretched between us, thick with the sound of the storm and the dripping water. The air was charged, the unspoken solution hanging there like the heavy, humid air. Liam was the one to say it, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. It's a queen bed, man. It's big enough, he paused, letting the offer settle. We can share. My mind went completely blank. Every circuit, every carefully constructed thought process just shorted out. Share his bed. The words echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of my own head. It was a logistical solution to a practical problem. It was the most sensible, logical thing to do. And it was the most terrifying, heart-stoppingly intimate proposition I could possibly imagine. My ordered world hadn't just been disrupted. It had been obliterated. And in its place was a single, terrifying, undeniable reality. I was going to spend the night in Liam's bed. The walk from my ruined bedroom to his was the longest 10 feet of my life. Each step was a conscious effort, my feet feeling heavy and disconnected from my body. Liam's room was a reflection of him, simple, functional, and comfortably messy. Clothes were draped over a chair. A few woodworking magazines lay fanned out on his nightstand next to a half-empty glass of water. And in the center of it all, illuminated by the single candle he'd placed on his dresser, was his bed. It looked enormous, a vast expanse of dark gray comforter and pillows that seemed to absorb the flickering light. It was his space, his most private territory, and I was about to be an intruder. I'll take the side by the wall, I mumbled, my voice sounding thin and reedy. It was a desperate attempt to impose some kind of order, some rule on a situation that felt utterly lawless. Sure, Liam said, his voice preternaturally calm. He was already pulling off his t-shirt, his back to me. The candlelight danced across the broad, defined muscles of his back, and I had to physically turn away, my eyes fixing on a random spot on the wall, as if it were the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen. My heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Getting ready for bed became a clumsy, silent ballet of avoidance. We tried to give each other space in the small room, turning our backs, bumping elbows, muttering apologies. The air grew thick with a tension that was entirely new. This wasn't our usual easy friendship. This was something else, something fragile and charged and deeply, deeply awkward. The scent of his room was overwhelming, not unpleasant, just intensely him. It was the clean, simple smell of his laundry soap, the faint, lingering notes of sawdust, and the warm, muskier scent of his skin. It was everywhere, and I felt like I was drowning in it. I slipped under the covers first, pressing myself as tightly against the cold wall as I could, creating a demilitarized zone of mattress between us. The sheets were cool against my skin, but they smelled of him, a scent that was both comforting and agonizing. I lay there, rigid, listening to him move around the room, the soft rustle of his clothes, the quiet click of his phone being placed on the nightstand. Then, the mattress dipped beside me. The weight of him settling into the bed felt like a seismic event. A wave of warmth radiated from his body, crossing the inches between us, a tangible heat that my skin registered with an almost painful acuity. I could hear him breathe, a slow, steady rhythm in the darkness. I held my own breath, trying to make myself smaller, trying to disappear into the mattress. "You okay over there?" His voice was a low rumble, so close it seemed to vibrate right through the pillow. "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice tight. "Fine. Plenty of room." A lie. There could have been an acre of space between us, and it would have felt too close. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, hyper-aware of his proximity. The tiny hairs on my arms stood on end, sensing the gravitational pull of his mass beside me. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, was a chaotic mess of sensation and panic. I could feel the heat of him. I could smell the clean scent of his soap. I could hear the whisper of the sheets as he shifted his weight. We lay there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the relentless drumming of the rain and our own quiet breathing. I stared into the darkness, my eyes wide open, tracing the patterns of the shadows on the ceiling. I tried to force my body to relax, to unknot the muscles in my shoulders and back, but I was a tightly coiled spring of anxiety and longing. Then, Liam spoke again, his voice softer this time, more thoughtful. "You know," he started, his voice barely a murmur. "I hate these storms, too." I turned my head slightly on the pillow, surprised. "You do? You always seem so calm." I could feel more than see him shake his head. "Nah, my dad hated them. Used to pace the house all night. Guess it just rubbed off. I just got better at pretending it doesn't bother me." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. Stupid, right? It was a small admission, a tiny crack in the confident, steady facade he always presented to the world. And in that moment, he ceased to be the untouchable sculpture in the museum. He was just Liam, lying in the dark, admitting to a fear. The velvet rope inside my head slackened just a little. "It's not stupid," I said, my voice finally sounding a bit more like my own. "My mom used to make us hide in the basement with board games. I think I'll forever associate the smell of damp concrete with Scrabble and panic." He chuckled, a genuine, warm sound this time. Yeah. The conversation faded back into a more comfortable silence. The tension had eased, replaced by a fragile, tentative intimacy. We were just two people, lying in the dark, sharing a small piece of ourselves to ward off the noise of the storm. My body began to relax, the rigid line of my spine softening. The warmth from his side of the bed felt less like a threat and more like a comfort, a human hearth against the cold of the night. I must have started to drift off, my mind finally letting go of its anxious grip, lulled by the rain and the unexpected confession. I was in that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, my thoughts blurring at the edges. The world had shrunk to the sound of his breathing and the warmth beside me. And then, I felt it. A shift in the mattress. It was slow, deliberate, not the unconscious twitch of a sleeping person, but a conscious, measured movement. The space between us, the carefully maintained buffer zone, began to shrink. Inch by inch, the source of that radiating warmth drew closer. My eyes snapped open in the darkness. My breathing stopped, my entire being focused on that single, terrifying, wonderful movement. He moved until the solid wall of his back was pressed firmly against mine. The contact was electric. A shock wave of heat and sensation shot through me, from the point of contact at my shoulder blades all the way down to my toes. It wasn't an accident. It couldn't have been. It was an intentional act, a crossing of a boundary that had been unspoken but absolute for years. My mind, which had just started to quiet down, exploded into a supernova of panicked, ecstatic light. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. I was dreaming. I had to be. I lay there, completely still, every muscle in my body locked tight. I was afraid to breathe, afraid that the slightest movement from me would break the spell, would make him realize his mistake and pull away. But he didn't pull away. Instead, after a moment that stretched into infinity, I felt another movement. His arm, the one that was trapped between our bodies, shifted. It slid slowly, impossibly, around my waist. His hand came to rest gently on my hip, his fingers curling slightly into the fabric of my t-shirt. There was no mistaking it now. This was not a dream. This was not an accident. This was a question being asked in the silent language of touch. The world outside, the raging storm, the dripping ceiling, my ruined room, it all ceased to exist. My universe contracted to the weight of his arm around me, the solid pressure of his back against mine, the warmth of his breath ghosting against my neck. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could feel the vibration. For years, my life had been a flat, two-dimensional design, all clean lines and empty spaces. In a single, silent moment, Liam had reached in and given it depth, texture, and a terrifying, brilliant color. The carefully constructed walls of my life, the ones I had spent years building and reinforcing, had just been leveled by a single, quiet touch in the dark. And I had no idea what to do. Sleep was an impossibility. I lay awake for hours, a statue carved from pure adrenaline, with Liam's arm draped over me and his steady breathing warming the back of my neck. Every theory I had ever constructed about him, about us, was in ruins. The foundation of our friendship, built on the bedrock assumption of his heterosexuality, had been pulverized. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, a way to fit this new, impossible data into my ordered worldview. Maybe he was sleepwalking, or having a vivid dream. Maybe he was just cold, seeking warmth unconsciously. My anxious brain offered up a dozen rationalizations, each one more flimsy than the last. But I couldn't escape the feeling, deep in my gut, that the movement had been deliberate. The way his hand rested on my hip felt too certain, too possessive to be an accident. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, he shifted again, pulling me even closer, his face nuzzling into the space between my shoulder blades. A soft, contented sigh escaped him. It was the sound that finally broke me. It was too intimate, too real. This was not the act of a man seeking platonic warmth. The hope that I had suppressed for years, a dangerous, feral thing, began to claw its way out of its cage. I didn't fall asleep until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the window, and when I did, it was a thin, dreamless sleep that lasted for what felt like only minutes. I woke to silence. The storm had passed. The rhythmic drumming of the rain was gone, replaced by a quiet, dripping stillness. For a blissful, disoriented second, I forgot where I was. Then I felt it. The empty space beside me. My eyes flew open. Liam was gone. The indentation on the pillow next to me was the only evidence he had been there at all. I sat up, my heart sinking with a cold, heavy dread. The intimacy of the night evaporated in the harsh morning light, leaving behind a thick, cloying residue of awkwardness and fear. It was a mistake. The thought slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. He woke up, realized what he'd done, and fled. He was disgusted. He was horrified. I had misread everything. The anxiety that had been held at bay by the shock of the night came rushing back in a tidal wave, drowning me in a sea of self-recrimination and panic. I had ruined our friendship. He would never be able to look at me again. I would have to move out. I would have to leave the city, change my name, and live as a hermit. My mind, my greatest enemy, began its relentless spiral. I pictured the conversation we would have to have, the pity and discomfort in his eyes. I imagined the stilted, polite way he would start treating me, the careful distance he would maintain. The warmth of his body against mine, which had felt like a promise just hours before, now felt like the scene of a crime. I forced myself out of bed, my movements stiff and robotic. The air in the apartment was cold and damp. I walked into the living room and found him in the kitchen, his back to me. He was standing over our small camping stove, a relic from a trip we'd taken years ago, boiling water in a saucepan. The low hiss of the gas flame was the only sound. He was dressed. He was already wearing his work jeans and a clean t-shirt. The sight of him, so fully back in his normal, daytime persona, made the events of the night feel even more like a fever dream. He hadn't turned when I entered. He must have heard me, but he kept his focus on the stove, his shoulders set in a tense, rigid line. The distance was palpable. It was a physical presence in the room, a chasm that had opened up between his side of the kitchen and mine. The easy camaraderie we shared, the comfortable silence that usually filled our mornings, was gone. In its place was this thick, suffocating quiet. "Morning," I managed to say, my voice a croak. "Morning," he replied, without turning around. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual warmth. It was confirmation. It was all the proof I needed. He regretted it. He was trying to pretend it never happened. The hope that had flickered to life in the dark was unceremoniously snuffed out. All that was left was the cold ash of humiliation. I moved to the counter, busying myself with finding 2 mugs, my hands shaking slightly. We moved around each other with the careful, stilted choreography of strangers, each hyper-aware of the other's position, taking pains not to let our arms brush or our eyes meet. He poured the hot water over the instant coffee grounds in our mugs, his movements precise and economical. He pushed my mug toward me across the counter without a word. We stood there, on opposite sides of the kitchen island, drinking our coffee in an unbearable silence. I stared down into the black liquid, my reflection a distorted, pathetic stranger. I needed to say something, to break the tension, to offer him an out. I had to be the one to dismiss it, to call it an accident, to restore our old, safe equilibrium. "About last night," I started, my voice barely a whisper. It was cold. He looked up then. He finally met my eyes, and the expression on his face stopped the words in my throat. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't pity or anger. It was something I couldn't read, something guarded and complicated and pained. He set his mug down on the counter with a soft, definitive click. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and serious. "We need to talk." My stomach plummeted. This was it. The formal address. The dreaded phrase. This was the opening line of the speech that would politely, but firmly, end our friendship. I braced myself, my knuckles white as I gripped my coffee mug, the ceramic my only anchor in a world that was about to come apart. "Okay," I whispered, preparing for the impact. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair in that familiar, nervous gesture. He wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the countertop between us. "Last night," he began, his voice strained. "What happened, it wasn't an accident." The world stopped spinning. The low hiss of the camp stove, the distant sound of a siren, the frantic drumming of my own heart. It all faded into a dull, white noise. I could only hear his words, hanging in the air like smoke. "Not an accident." He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine again, and this time, the guarded expression was gone. In its place was a raw, terrifying vulnerability that mirrored my own. "I wasn't asleep, Ethan," he said, his voice quiet but firm, each word a carefully placed stone building a bridge across the chasm between us. I've wanted to do that for a long time." I just stared at him, my mind unable to process the information. It was like trying to read a language I'd never seen before. The sentences were forming, but the meaning was too vast, too world-altering to comprehend. Long time. He'd talked about women. He'd dated them. My brain clung to the old data, the established facts. "But you're not." I couldn't even say the word. A wry, sad smile touched his lips. I know what you think. What I let you think." He leaned his hands on the counter, his broad shoulders slumping slightly. "Those girls, it was all just going through the motions. Trying to be what I thought I was supposed to be. But it never felt right. It always felt hollow." He paused, taking another breath. "And then there was you. You were my best friend. And being around you, it was the only time things felt real. Solid. For years, I just told myself it was friendship. That it was normal to feel this way about your best friend." He shook his head slowly. "But it wasn't. It isn't. I'd listen to you talk about some guy you went on a date with, and I'd feel this thing in my chest. This ugly, possessive jealousy. and I didn't know what to do with it. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. I was a coward, man. I was so terrified of losing you, of freaking you out, that I just stayed quiet. I built up my own walls. My carefully constructed universe, which had been cracked and damaged by the storm, was now being rebuilt, piece by piece, into a shape I never thought possible. His words were the mortar, filling in the gaps, creating a new, stronger foundation. The years of my secret pining, my lonely observations, my quiet ache. He had been feeling it too, on the other side of a wall I never even knew he had. The breath I had been holding rushed out of me in a shaky exhale. The mug in my hands trembled. I set it down before I could drop it. Liam, I said, my own voice thick with a relief so profound it felt like grief. I have been in love with you for years. The confession, the words I had sworn I would take to my grave, felt impossibly easy to say out loud. They weren't a wrecking ball. They were a key, unlocking the final door between us. A wave of emotion washed over his face. Shock, relief, a dawning, incredulous joy. In 3 long strides, he was around the counter, standing in front of me, his presence filling my entire field of vision. He gently took my face in his big, warm, calloused hands, his thumbs stroking my cheeks. "You have?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. Tears I didn't know I was holding back welled in my eyes. "All this time," he breathed, a look of wonder on his face. "All this time, we were both so stupid." And then he kissed me. It was nothing like the fumbling, uncertain touches in the dark. This was sure. This was certain. In the cold, gray light of the morning, his lips were warm and firm against mine. It wasn't a kiss of frantic, desperate passion, but one of profound, soul-deep relief. It was a kiss that tasted of cheap instant coffee and years of unspoken words. It was the feeling of a lock clicking open, of a long-held breath finally being released. It felt like coming home. The days that followed were strange and beautiful, like learning to walk again after a long illness. The architecture of our relationship had been fundamentally altered, and we had to learn how to navigate the new space. The awkwardness of that first morning gave way to a tentative, shy sweetness. The first time he reached for my hand while we were watching a movie on the couch, his fingers lacing through mine, sent a jolt through me that was both startling and deeply comforting. It felt illicit and, at the same time, like the most natural thing in the world. We didn't talk about it again, not in the same raw, confessional way. We didn't need to. The conversation had shifted from words to actions. It was in the way he'd bring me a cup of coffee in the morning, his fingers lingering on mine as I took the mug. It was in the way I'd find myself watching him work on a design at his workbench, no longer from a safe distance, but with my chin resting on his shoulder, his arm casually wrapped around my waist. The apartment, once my sterile sanctuary, was now filled with a quiet, joyful intimacy. The air itself felt different, charged with a new potential. His presence, once a glorious disruption, was now an essential part of my own composition. He wasn't chaos anymore. He was the anchor point, the strong, solid line around which the rest of my design could now flourish. My rigid grids began to soften, the straight lines curving to make room for him. I found his stray sock on the floor, and instead of feeling a spike of irritation at the disorder, I just smiled and picked it up. One evening, about a week after the storm, we were cooking dinner together. Rain was tapping softly against the window, a gentle echo of the deluge that had changed everything. I was chopping vegetables, and Liam came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my chest and resting his chin on my shoulder, watching my hands work. The familiar scent of sawdust and soap enveloped me, but now it wasn't something I could only admire. It was mine to breathe in. "You know," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "The landlord called. Said they can't get a roofer out to fix your ceiling until next month." I paused my chopping, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Oh, really? That's a shame." He tightened his arms around me, his lips brushing against my neck. "A real tragedy." He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked, his voice soft and tinged with a teasing warmth. "You sure you have enough room in my bed? It can get a little crowded." I leaned back into his solid warmth, my heart full and steady. The memory of that night, once a source of frantic anxiety, was now a shared, private joke, a cornerstone of our new reality. The storm had broken my roof and flooded my room. It had shattered my routines and demolished the neat, orderly life I had built for myself. It had forced me into a situation of terrifying vulnerability, stripping away all my defenses. And in doing so, it had broken down the walls between us, the ones I hadn't even realized he had built, too. It had washed away years of fear and misunderstanding, leaving behind something clean and true. I had spent so long living in the safety of my own carefully curated museum, admiring him from afar. I had mistaken control for peace and order for happiness. But true peace wasn't the absence of chaos. It was finding an anchor in the storm. It was lying in the dark, terrified and hopeful, and feeling him move closer.